They thought he was just another quiet black kid, but in this town, silence is sometimes the loudest thing of all. That's where this story begins, not with noise, not with headlines, but with a stillness that wrapped around our town like a slow southern wind. We're talking about a place where time don't move too fast, somewhere between Waco and nowhere. Folks wave at each other from the porch dogs, nap under pickup trucks, and folks still leave their front doors unlocked on Sundays. In towns like this, stories don't travel fast, but they sure do travel far, especially stories like this. It started one Thursday morning in late October, the kind of morning where the sky's brushed with the soft orange of a Texas sunrise and you can smell the earth cooling from the night. The fields looked like they'd been dipped in honey, and the air carried the sound of distant crows and tractor engines warming up. That's when Jeremiah Cole came to town, 13 years old, skin like polished walnut, a duffel bag bigger than he was slung over one shoulder, and a look in his eyes like he'd already seen more than most grown men ever would. His parents were gone lost in a car wreck just outside of Atlanta. All he had left was his grandmother, Miss Thelma, a retired nurse with strong hands, a straighter back than most preachers, and a Bible on her kitchen table that looked older than the town itself. They moved into the little blue house on the corner of Oak Street, quiet, kept to themselves. You wouldn't have looked twice at the boy unless you were looking for something, and some folks were. See, Jeremiah didn't talk much, didn't smile much either. He'd sit alone at lunch, draw in a weathered notebook, and walk with his head down like he didn't want to take up space. Wore hand-me-down shoes and the same flannel jacket even when the sun was blazing. To the wrong kind of kids that makes you a target. Trent, Bradley, and Kyle. They were the big fish in a very small pond. Loud, confident, mean in the way only bored boys can be. And when they saw Jeremiah, they didn't see a boy. They saw weakness. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jeremiah had a fire buried deep. Something passed down, not shouted. A strength that wasn't for show. And the moment they chose to mess with him was the moment everything began to change. Because in this small, sleepy Texas town, they bullied the wrong black kid and they paid the price. The first time Jeremiah stepped into Middleton Junior High, nobody paid him any mind. Kids were too busy scrolling their phones or throwing footballs across the yard to notice the quiet boy with a worn backpack and shoes with soles starting to peel. He walked with his head down, not out of shame, more like someone used to watching where he stepped. He didn't say much in class. Sat in the last row near the window, the kind of spot you choose when you're used to disappearing. His voice, when he did speak, was soft but steady. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. Always polite. Always respectful. That first week, most teachers marked him as quiet but cooperative, the kind of kid who doesn't cause trouble and doesn't seem to want any friends either. But the kids noticed. They always do. And in a school like Middleton, where football captains ruled the cafeteria and family names mattered more than GPAs, someone like Jeremiah didn't fit the mold. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to be funny. He just existed. And sometimes that's enough to draw heat, especially from boys like Trent, Bradley, and Kyle. They were 8th graders full of swagger and bad intentions. Their daddies owned cattle land and their uncles sat on school boards. They walked those hallways like they owned them. And when they saw Jeremiah, all they saw was an easy target. It started with whispers. Who's the new charity case bet his grandma gets food stamps? Then came the snickers in gym class when Jeremiah showed up in plain black sneakers instead of brand-name Nikes. One morning, Jeremiah opened his locker and found someone had stuffed it full of used napkins and a banana peel. He didn't say a word, just cleaned it up, closed the door, and kept walking. Another day during lunch, Trent tripped him as he passed by with a tray of cornbread and chili. Food went flying. Laughter filled the room. But Jeremiah, he just stood up, wiped the chili off his shirt, and kept walking. Not a word, not a look, not even a flinch. And that unsettled them more than anything. See, bullies feed off reaction. They want fear, tears, anger, But when Jeremiah gave them nothing, they grew meaner, louder. He became a test they couldn't pass, and that made them furious. Meanwhile, a few adults were beginning to notice. Mr. Wallace, the old history teacher with a limp and a sharp eye, started watching Jeremiah more closely. Not just because he cared, but because something in the boy's stillness felt familiar. Like he'd seen that kind of calm before in war zones and barracks. That kind of quiet doesn't come from shyness. It comes from control. Mr. Wallace had seen it in soldiers. The ones who'd been through the worst and came out the other side with something inside them no one could shake. And the longer he watched Jeremiah, the more he wondered, what's that boy holding back? Because in Middleton, Texas, silence wasn't just golden. It was dangerous. Bullies rarely stop on their own. And in Jeremiah's case, the quieter he stayed, the bolder they got. By the second week, things went from petty to personal. Trent and his boys didn't just laugh at Jeremiah, they began planning ways to humiliate him. To them, it wasn't enough that he was quiet or poor. The real offense was that he didn't respond, didn't react, didn't break. And that made them angry. It began on the football field. During PE, the coach, young and distracted, threw Jeremiah into a scrimmage with the 8th grade team. He was the only 7th grader out there, thin as a twig in his baggy jersey. Trent saw it as an open invitation. On the first play, Trent blindsided him with a tackle late and low. Jeremiah hit the ground hard, the wind knocked clean out of him. The coach yelled, "Play fair," but didn't pull Trent off the field. Jeremiah stood up without complaint, brushed off the grass, and got back in line. The next play, Bradley accidentally elbowed him in the ribs. Still, Jeremiah said nothing. That night at dinner, Miss Thelma noticed the bruises along his side as he changed his shirt. She paused, gently placed her fork down, and said, "You don't gotta fight every battle, baby. But don't you dare let them turn you bitter either." Jeremiah just nodded and went back to his room. The next day, things escalated further. Someone scratched the word loser into the cover of his notebook. Someone else switched his locker combination, locking his books away before a big math test. A few boys even spread a rumor that Jeremiah didn't have parents, that he was dumped on the town like a stray. No one stopped it. Not even the teachers who heard the laughter and saw the paper balls flying across the room. Some of them probably figured boys will be boys. But boys can be cruel, especially when no one holds them accountable. One rainy afternoon, the boys cornered Jeremiah behind the gym after school. The halls were empty, the teachers long gone. It was just the 4 of them, Trent, Bradley, Kyle, and Jeremiah. Bradley shoved him first. Jeremiah didn't move. Kyle got closer and flicked his ear. "Say something, Cole. You mute or just too scared?" Trent grinned. "Bet he cries if we mess up that little drawing book he keeps." He reached for Jeremiah's backpack. And that's when Jeremiah moved. But not the way they expected. He didn't punch, didn't kick. He took one slow step backward, looked Trent dead in the eyes, and said, "You really think pain scares me?" That stopped them. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Calm, measured. Like a man who's seen worse things than bullies in a schoolyard. Trent froze for a beat, then scoffed and walked away. But from that moment on, something shifted. The boys didn't stop, not completely, but now there was unease in the way they looked at him. Like they'd poked something they didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, Mr. Wallace had seen enough. He'd witnessed the bruises, the tension, the way Jeremiah sat perfectly still in class like a coiled spring. After school one day, he pulled Jeremiah aside. "Son," he said, "you remind me of a soldier I once knew. Quiet, disciplined, carried pain like it was stitched into his skin. You don't have to tell me anything, but just know, I see you, and I'm watching out." Jeremiah looked him in the eye and gave a single nod. No smile, no tears, just that same silent strength. Outside, the skies over Middleton darkened. Thunder rumbled over the flat land like a warning, And somewhere in that little blue house on Oak Street, Jeremiah stood barefoot in the shed out back, surrounded by shadows and memories practicing forms his father had once taught him. Strike, breathe, block, balance. Again. Because deep down, Jeremiah knew something the others didn't. They hadn't broken him. They were sharpening him. And every insult, every shove, every cruel laugh was preparing him for the moment he'd stop being silent and start being seen. The rain came that night, slow at first, like a whisper tapping on the rooftop of the little blue house on Oak Street. Jeremiah sat in his room, lights off, watching the water snake its way down the window pane. Outside, the world blurred. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet for a boy his age. Miss Thelma stood at the stove, stirring a pot of chicken and dumplings. Her back straight, her movements measured the same way she'd always been, even after her knees got bad, even after her son died. She called out softly, "Supper's on, baby." Jeremiah came to the table, sat down without a word. His shirt was damp. His knuckles were scraped raw, not from a fight, but from gripping something too tightly for too long. She placed the bowl in front of him, then sat down with her own. They ate in silence for a minute, just the ticking of the old kitchen clock and the patter of rain. Then Thelma looked up. "You got that look again," she said. He didn't answer. "Like your daddy used to," she went on. "When the world pushed too hard and he didn't want to push back. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew what would happen if he did." Jeremiah's spoon froze midair. Miss Thelma leaned back in her chair, eyes far off now. "Your daddy, Thomas Cole, he wasn't just a man. He was a storm wrapped in stillness. People thought his kindness meant weakness, but they didn't know. They didn't see him move." Jeremiah blinked. "You mean with the military?" She chuckled gently. "Before that, long before. Your daddy was trained in martial arts since he was 6. Not sport karate, not them little belts they hand out at strip mall dojos. No, baby. Your father trained in Okinawa under Master Fuji. Real discipline, real silence. He never told me," Jeremiah whispered. "He didn't have to," she said. "You think them hands of yours don't remember. You think your breath don't fall in rhythm, the same way his did." She reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out an old wooden box, worn smooth from time. She slid it across the table. Jeremiah opened it slowly. Inside was a faded photograph his father, younger than Jeremiah had ever seen him, bowing in front of an old Japanese man. Next to it, a black belt frayed at the edges but folded with care, and at the bottom, a leather-bound notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams, techniques, footwork philosophy. He stared at it all like staring into a past he hadn't realized belonged to him. Why? Why didn't anyone tell me? Thelma folded her hands, voice steady. "Because power without understanding is dangerous. And you weren't ready." Jeremiah closed the box slowly. "I don't want to hurt nobody." "I know," she said, reaching across the table to place her hand gently over his. "And that's why you're ready now." She held his gaze. "You're gonna be tested, child. Not in no tournament, not in a ring, but in life. And when that test comes, it won't be about fists or kicks. It'll be about knowing who you are and who you refuse to become." Jeremiah sat with those words heavy as stone. The rain outside grew louder. Later that night, after Thelma had gone to bed, he crept out into the old shed out back. The light was dim, a single bulb swinging from the rafters. Dust hung in the air like memory. He laid the belt on the workbench, opened the notebook, flipped past pages of strikes and stances until he found one labeled "Breath Under Fire." He stood in the center of the floor, closed his eyes, and began to move. Each step, each breath, each motion slow, purposeful, flowing like water over stone. His arms sliced through the air in silence. His body followed patterns he didn't remember learning but had always known. It wasn't violence. It was memory. It was control. And in that moment, Jeremiah wasn't just practicing. He was reclaiming. Outside, the rain poured harder. Lightning split the sky. But in that small wooden shed in Texas, a storm was learning to stand. There's always a moment before the storm when the air gets still. Birds stop singing. Dogs go quiet. Folks stare at the sky like it's about to speak. That was Middleton, Texas, the week everything came to a head. From the outside, nothing had changed. Kids still shuffled through hallways, dragging book bags and gossip. Teachers still passed out spelling tests and coffee breath. The leaves turned gold along Main Street, and pumpkins sat proudly on porches. But inside that school, something was shifting. Jeremiah Cole, the quiet black boy, no one thought twice about, had signed up for the school talent show. He didn't tell anyone what he was performing. Didn't brag, didn't invite friends. He just walked up to the sign-up sheet outside the cafeteria, wrote his name in neat block letters, and walked away. By lunchtime, the whole school was buzzing. What's he gonna do, read poetry? Maybe he's one of them ventriloquists. I bet it's mime. Quiet kids always do mime. But Trent didn't laugh. He squinted at Jeremiah from across the lunchroom and felt something crawl up the back of his neck. Something that felt a whole lot like threat. And boys like Trent didn't like to feel threatened, especially not by someone like Jeremiah. So that night, while most kids were putting the final touches on their performances, Trent was cooking up a different kind of plan. The next morning, Jeremiah opened his locker to find it ransacked. Papers ripped, pencil case gone. And at the very bottom, his most sacred possession, his father's martial arts notebook, missing. In its place, taped to the inside wall, was a single note written in sloppy Sharpie: "See you on stage, Jackie Chan." Jeremiah stood still. He didn't yell, didn't cry. He just slowly closed the locker door, turned, and walked to class. But Miss Thelma knew. That evening, she found him out back behind the shed, sitting on an old wooden stool in the fading orange of a Texas sunset, staring into nothing. She didn't say a word, just sat beside him. Two silhouettes in silence. After a few long minutes, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Your daddy gave me this," she said. "Said to give it to you when the world pushed harder than you thought you could push back." Jeremiah unfolded the note slowly. His father's handwriting read, "Real strength ain't in your fists. It's in knowing when not to use them. But if you must, don't miss." The next morning was clear and bright, almost too bright, like the sky was daring something to happen. The school gym had been transformed for the big day. Folding chairs, cheap plastic stars on the walls, a handmade banner that read, "Middleton Junior Talent Show, let your light shine." Parents packed the bleachers. Teachers hovered near the edges, sipping coffee from paper cups. Kids whispered and giggled backstage, adjusting costumes and reciting lines under their breath. Trent and his boys waited too, not to perform, but to watch. They had Jeremiah's notebook. Hid it in a locker, planning to show it around after the show and make a mockery of whatever act he dared to attempt. Backstage, Jeremiah stood alone. He had no props, no music, just an old flannel jacket and the memory of movements buried deep in his bones. When the announcer called his name, Jeremiah Cole, 7th grade, the crowd gave a polite, uncertain clap. He stepped into the spotlight, and the room fell silent. Because something about the way he walked, slow, steady shoulders relaxed, didn't fit the nervous energy of most kids. He bowed to the crowd. Then he moved. One breath. Then a motion so precise, so fluid, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like watching water take shape. His arms sliced through the air in graceful arcs. His feet planted with quiet thunder. His eyes, calm, unwavering, stared straight ahead like he was facing down ghosts no one else could see. It wasn't a show. It was a revelation. And the moment his final stance echoed through the gym floor, legs grounded, arms poised like a statue in motion, the crowd sat in stunned silence. Not a single word. until someone, it might have been Mr. Wallace, began to clap. Then another, and another, until the room erupted in a standing ovation. You could have heard a pin drop when Jeremiah Cole finished his performance. No one clapped right away, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. In a town where piano recitals and baton twirling usually won the day, a quiet boy in a faded flannel had just held the entire gym hostage with nothing but breath discipline and the echo of movements older than most of the folks in that room. And then the applause came. Slow, respectful, and then rolling like thunder off the walls. It wasn't just the students or the teachers. Even the janitor stood in the back with his mop leaning against the wall, clapping with a little tear caught in the corner of his eye. And right there in the third row of the bleachers stood Miss Thelma, her back straight, hands folded over her chest, lips trembling into a soft smile. She didn't cheer, she didn't shout, she just nodded, as if to say, "There you are, child, I see you now," and more importantly, they do too. Backstage, some of the kids who used to giggle when Jeremiah walked by now sat in stunned silence. Even a couple of teachers looked sideways at one another like they'd misjudged the boy. But Trent's jaw was locked. He'd watched the whole thing from the side curtain fists in his hoodie pockets, blood boiling. It wasn't just that Jeremiah had performed well. It was that he'd taken the very thing they tried to use against him, his silence, his strangeness, even his notebook, and turned it into something so powerful the whole town stood up for him. And nothing bruises a bully deeper than being overshadowed by someone he thought was beneath him. So Trent left, stormed out of the gym with Bradley and Kyle trailing behind him like dogs without bark. They didn't say a word, just followed their ringleader back into the hallways where the echoes of applause still faintly lingered. "This ain't over," Trent spat, slamming his fist into the locker door. He thinks he's tough now. He don't know nothing. But deep inside, he was rattled. And Jeremiah, he didn't stick around for the cookies and juice, didn't pose for pictures. When the last curtain fell, he slipped quietly out the back entrance, cutting through the dark parking lot alone, his jacket zipped tight against the autumn breeze. But someone was waiting. Jeremiah. He turned. It was Mr. Wallace. The old history teacher stepped forward, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't say much, just handed Jeremiah a folded envelope with yellowed edges. "Your father left this with me," he said. "Told me to give it to you when you earned it, not when you turned a certain age. When you earned it." Jeremiah took it with steady hands, nodding once. Later that night in his small room above the kitchen, he opened it. Inside was a photo his father, tall and proud in marine dress blues, flanked by a unit of soldiers. But there was something else, a letter written in bold, exact handwriting. "Jeremiah, if you're reading this, then I reckon you've become the kind of young man who knows the difference between fighting for something and fighting against everything. Remember, your silence is not weakness. Your calm is not surrender. And your strength has always been in you. Now the world knows it too. Dad." Jeremiah sat with that letter a long time, the words ringing in his ears like scripture. And for the first time in a while, he smiled. The next day at school, the halls were different. Teachers nodded. Students moved out of his way. Not with fear, but with a newfound respect. Even some of the younger kids whispered his name like he was something between a legend and a ghost. But bullies don't vanish overnight. After lunch, Jeremiah returned to his locker to find it unlocked. His father's notebook was back neatly placed on the top shelf. But taped to the front was a note scribbled in angry, uneven letters: "You won the show. But you ain't won us. We're not done." Jeremiah stared at it for a long time, then calmly took it down and tore it in half. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need approval. He had already won where it mattered, but there was one more moment waiting. That evening, as the sun dipped below the cotton fields west of town, Jeremiah walked home under a sky blooming orange and purple. The wind carried the scent of oak and coming rain. At the porch, Miss Thelma was waiting apron on, holding 2 steaming mugs of sweet tea. She didn't speak, just handed him the cup and sat beside him on the porch swing. They rocked in silence a while. Then she said, "Your daddy would been proud, but I reckon he already was. He just didn't get to see what I got to see tonight." Jeremiah looked out across the yard, then down at the notebook in his lap. "I didn't think it'd mean anything," he said. "Just a few moves, some old paper." Thelma smiled, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Child, sometimes it's the quietest roots that grow the tallest trees. The thing about bullies is they don't go down easy. When you take away their power in public, they don't walk away humbled. They stew, they plot, they wait for darkness for a moment when no one's watching. And that's exactly what Trent did. For 3 days after the talent show, he stayed quiet. Too quiet. Not a whisper, not a shove, not even a smirk. Just silence. And in a school like Middleton Junior High, that was more terrifying than any threat. But Jeremiah, he didn't flinch. He moved through the halls like always, calm, still, eyes steady. Teachers greeted him differently now. Students made space in the lunch line. He didn't ask for it, but it came anyway. And that only made Trent more furious. So when Friday rolled around, the day of the fall field trip to the old Fort Sam military site, Trent decided that was the moment. No cameras, no stage, no teachers hovering, just open woods, dirt trails, and opportunity. They boarded the buses around 8 a.m. Miss Thelma had packed Jeremiah a small brown bag with turkey sandwiches and an oatmeal cookie. "Stay sharp," she whispered, "but stay soft where it matters." He smiled at her from the bus window, then leaned back into his seat, unaware that Bradley and Kyle had stuffed something heavy into their backpacks. 2 hours later, they arrived at the fort, a stretch of open land with rusted cannons, wooden cabins, and one long trail that led to a dried-up creek. Kids scattered in groups. Teachers gave their usual warning, "Stay with your buddy. Don't go past the creek." But Trent had other plans. Around noon, he casually bumped Jeremiah's shoulder in line for sandwiches. "You think you're tough?" he whispered. "Still quiet, huh? Let's see how tough you are without a stage." Jeremiah didn't respond. He just stared back. Not angry, not scared, just certain. That stare only fueled Trent more. By 1:15, Jeremiah found himself near the far end of the trail, separated from the group just as Trent wanted. He was kneeling near a tree, watching a line of ants march across a fallen branch, when he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. Too heavy to be teachers, too slow to be curious students. He turned around. Trent, Bradley, Kyle, 3 shadows against the sunlight. "You made us look stupid," Trent growled. "In front of the whole school." Jeremiah stood up slowly. "I didn't make you do anything," he said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You did that yourself." "Wrong answer." Trent lunged forward, shoving him hard against the tree. "You think you're better than us, with your little ninja moves and your quiet boy act." Bradley circled to the side, grabbing Jeremiah's backpack and yanking it away. "Let's see what kind of warrior you really are," Kyle muttered, cracking his knuckles. But before the next blow landed, a voice rang out. "Hey!" Everyone froze. Out of the woods stepped Noah Jenkins, the last person any of them expected. Noah was tall, awkward, red-headed, the kid who always sat at the front of the bus, sketching superhero comics and getting picked last in dodgeball. But today, he didn't look scared. He looked done. "I already told the chaperones," he said, holding up his phone, "and I recorded everything." Trent's face twisted. "You little snitch. I'm not scared of you anymore." "Trent," Noah said, stepping between Jeremiah and the boys, "you think you run this school? You're just loud." Jeremiah's eyes flicked toward Noah, surprised but respectful. Trent glanced at the phone, then at Bradley, then back at the woods. The fight left his body like air from a popped balloon. Without another word, he turned around and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. Bradley and Kyle hesitated, then followed. Jeremiah and Noah stood in the clearing, the wind brushing leaves around their shoes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Noah chuckled softly. "You know," he said, "that was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done." Jeremiah smiled. "No," he said, "that was brave." They walked back toward the group together, the quiet kid and the comic book artist. Two people no one expected to matter. But that day, they mattered. A lot. And back on the bus as they bumped down the old country road toward home, Miss Thelma sat quietly in the front seat watching Jeremiah from the mirror. He didn't look different, but he was. Because sometimes you don't need to throw a punch to win the fight. Sometimes all it takes is standing up. Spring came gently to Middleton, Texas. The kind of spring that doesn't knock but eases in through creaky screen doors under rocking chairs into the space between silence and song. Jeremiah Cole, now a little taller and a whole lot wiser, didn't look much different from the boy who first stepped into that school gym. But something inside had shifted, settled like roots. The fear that once trailed him like a shadow was gone. Not because the world had become kinder, but because he had become stronger. Each morning he walked to school with steady steps. He didn't need crowds or applause. The noise of victory had passed. What remained was something deeper, quiet authority. Noah Jenkins still sat beside him at lunch, their silence a comfortable conversation. Some days they'd laugh, other days they'd say nothing, and somehow those were the best ones, because silence when shared becomes something holy. As for the others, Bradley kept his head down. Kyle transferred schools quietly. And Trent, the one who once ruled with fists and fear faded into the background of memory, just another chapter in a story no longer his to tell. But not all battles end in shouts. Some end in teaching. By May, Jeremiah began helping the PE teacher with the younger kids. Not to show off, but to pass something on. He called it learning to stand. No belts, no ranks, just breath, balance, and backbone. One afternoon, a wide-eyed third grader asked Mr. Cole, "Is it true you beat up the bullies?" Jeremiah chuckled. "No," he said softly. "I just didn't let them win." At home, Miss Thelma continued her quiet ministry from the porch swing, gospel humming through the screen door, her hands always working, shelling peas, folding laundry, writing letters she'd never send. One evening, as the sun bowed low and the crickets began their hymn, she called Jeremiah over and handed him a wooden box. Inside a folded flag, a faded photo, and his father's medals, one of them dulled, the other still shining. On top lay a single note yellowed at the corners. "To my son. If you're reading this, you've already proven more than I ever hoped. You've stood tall without shouting. You've fought without violence. You've become a man in the quiet way real men do, with love, with honor, and with discipline. You don't need a battlefield. The world is your field, and you're already winning. Dad." Jeremiah read the letter once, then again, and again. He didn't cry. Not that night. He just looked at. Miss Thelma nodded once and said, "He saw me." She smiled through misty eyes. "He always did, baby. I just needed to catch up." And right there, under a Texas sky stitched with stars, a legacy was no longer just a memory. It was alive, breathing, moving forward through the choices Jeremiah made every single day. Because legacy isn't just medals in a box or stories told at reunions. It's how we respond when no one's clapping. It's how we act when no one's watching. It's what we carry when the world tries to take everything from us, and still we choose grace. Jeremiah didn't need revenge. He didn't need to get even. He had already won by becoming a young man his father would have been proud to salute. Not for what he did, but for what he chose not to do. And as the school year drew to a close, one final question lingered in the hearts of those who watched his story unfold. What do we do with the pain we inherit? Do we pass it on in anger, in fear, in silence? Or do we break the cycle and turn pain into purpose? Jeremiah made his choice. Not once, but every day. And that is the final lesson. Because in a world that often confuses noise with strength and retaliation with justice, Jeremiah showed us a better way, a quieter way. One where stillness becomes a sword and restraint becomes a shield. Where legacy isn't something left behind, but something we build moment by moment, breath by breath. So now, dear listener, maybe it's your turn. Have you ever faced a moment where you could have struck back but instead chose something higher? A lesson, a legacy, or even just peace? Or maybe someone stood up for you when no one else would share your story below. Let's honor those silent victories and remind the world that true strength often whispers.